Good afternoon, everybody, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the Knowledge Lab on advancing gender-responsive climate action here at the ADB Gender Forum. My name is Amy Reggers, and I'm really pleased to be here today with colleagues from IISD, WEDO, and also a representative from the government of Nepal to discuss the importance and also the progress on gender-responsive climate action. So before we begin today, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. Please note that this session is being recorded, as is the chat today. And please also note that captions are available by clicking on the CC on the Zoom menu bar. If you have connection issues, you can simply re-enter by clicking on the link in the attendee hub to reconnect. And finally, we're very happy to welcome questions today in this session. Please use the Q&A function, which I'm sure you're familiar with on Zoom at the bottom of the Zoom screen, which will be happily directing to all of the different speakers today in turn as we hear them present. So let's begin. First, I'd like to share a short video with you on why gender matters for effective adaptation to climate change by the International Institute of Sustainable Development. And then we're going to move to our first speaker directly, which is Dekens from IISD. And she's going to talk to us and present on how a country can pursue gender-responsive NAP processes. So sit back and enjoy the video.
Why gender matters for effective adaptation to climate change. The impacts of climate change, including seasonal changes, sea level rise, and extreme weather events, are already affecting people's lives in both subtle and devastating ways. Adaptation to climate change is the process of building the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies to these impacts. It requires action at all levels, from individuals, governments, and the international community. For adaptation to be effective, it's important to recognize that the impacts of climate change affect different people in different ways. How they are affected depends on where they live and how they earn their livelihoods. In many contexts, it also depends on their gender. Women, men, and non-binary people often play different roles in their households and communities. They also have different access to resources and opportunities. These differences influence their vulnerability to climate risks, as well as their capacity to prepare for and manage the impacts. Women and non-binary people are often at a disadvantage as they face barriers in realizing their rights due to norms, traditions, and policies that perpetuate gender inequality. Other forms of discrimination, for example, based on race, being indigenous, or having a disability, also play a role in making some people more vulnerable than others to the same climate impacts. This means we can't look at gender in isolation. A gender-responsive approach is intersectional, recognizing that people have multiple identities that shape their experiences. A gender-responsive approach focuses on three things: who matters, who decides, and who benefits. The answer to the question of who matters is, of course, everyone. Everyone matters when it comes to managing the impacts of climate change. This means that investments in adaptation must be designed to meet different needs, taking into account people's gender and their social status. When it comes to who decides, we must consider who is typically excluded from planning and decision-making. A gender-responsive approach brings diverse voices to the table, recognizing the value of their knowledge and their potential as agents of change. Without careful attention to gender and social dynamics, there is a risk that adaptation investments actually reinforce existing inequalities in wealth and power structures, rather than benefiting the most vulnerable people. Adaptation is effective when it is equitable, providing opportunities and benefits for all people. Governments, private sector actors, civil society organizations, and communities around the world are ramping up efforts to respond to the impacts of climate change. we have an opportunity to ensure that these efforts also generate progress towards gender equality. To make this happen, we need a gender-responsive approach to adaptation. This is the only way we can build families, communities, and societies that are resilient to the impacts of climate change.
Hi everyone, so the video we just watched explain why gender matter for effective climate adaptation. My presentation is taking us to the next question, which is how a country can pursue gender responsive climate adaptation, particularly in the context of National Adaptation Plan or NAP processes. So for those of you who are less familiarized with the NAP process, NAPs are a key mechanism for advancing climate adaptation in the context or under the UNFCCC. So of course, countries have been working on advancing climate adaptation well before the NAP process was formally established under the UNFCCC in 2010. NAPs aims to support a different way of doing climate adaptation. The essence of NAPs is really to try to shift from project-based ad hoc intervention to more strategic and coordinated approach to climate adaptation. So at the center of NAPs is the idea to put in place the systems and the capacities that are needed to make adaptation business as usual, with the ultimate objective to achieve climate resilient development. So NAPs are more than just a plan, it's a process. And on the screen, the figure that you see shows two cycles. The outer cycles represent the NAP process, which can be thought of as three broad steps. The first step being planning, then implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation. So under the planning phase, countries are assessing their vulnerabilities and their risk to climate change, and they are identifying solutions for managing these risks and vulnerabilities. Under the implementation phase, countries are developing strategies for responding for managing these risks. They are securing financing, and they are also deploying technical and human resources. And then finally, under the monitoring and evaluation phase, progress, results, lessons learned are being tracked and documented. So what it means is that government, the private sector, civil societies, organization, we look at national adaptation plans to guide their investment in climate adaptation going forward. So this is a huge opportunity to advance gender responsive climate action. But concretely, how can countries move forward and use a gender responsive approach in their NAP process? So to answer this question, we developed a toolkit which specifically aims to support countries' efforts to pursue gender responsive NAP processes. So the toolkit was developed by the NAP Global Network in collaboration with the Adaptation Committee, as well as the Least Developed Countries Experts Group, the LEG, under the UNFCCC. And this resource was developed in 2019. The toolkit primarily targets governments that are coordinating the NAP process, but it can also be useful to other stakeholders that are involved in supporting climate adaptation planning and implementation. And of course, we recognize that there are already a lot of gender mainstreaming guidance out there. So the objective with this toolkit was not to duplicate or reinvent the wheel, but rather to develop something that is very much targeted and specific to NAP processes. So broadly, the toolkit is organized around two key sections, one focusing on entry points or key steps in the NAP process where gender can be integrated, and another section focusing on enabling activities. And so for each entry point and each enabling activities, the toolkit addresses three key questions, which you can see on the screen. What is the aim of adopting a gender-responsive approach at that step or in the specific enabling activity? Why is it important? And what concrete action you can take? Or in other words, what does it look like to take a gender-responsive approach at that specific step? So next, I would like to give you a concrete example of how the toolkit has been applied, the difference it can make. And for that, I'm going to use the example of Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, where I have been working closely with the government since 2018 to help them pursue a gender-responsive NAP process. So last month, the Ministry of Women and the Ministry of Environment in Côte d'Ivoire signed for the first time a memorandum of understanding to accelerate or increase the collaboration between the two ministries on the linkages between gender and climate change. The memorandum of understanding was also the goal of the memorandum of understanding was also to ensure that both ministries are systematically addressing the linkages between gender and climate change in their respective policies, strategies, and programs. So we think this is a major achievement to advance gender-responsive climate action. The government of Côte d'Ivoire, as well as many other governments, are making a lot of efforts to integrate climate adaptation and gender equality in their development planning efforts. But what we see is that those two strategic priorities are often treated separately. So that also means that the linkages between the two are often overlooked. So, and ultimately this means that investment in this area is not as effective as they could be. So here are some of the steps that Côte d'Ivoire took to address this issue. So first of all, Côte d'Ivoire currently is in the development phase of its NAP process, and their main focus is on assessing vulnerabilities in priority sectors to inform the identification of priority adaptation options. Their objective next year is to develop their National Adaptation Plan. Vulnerability assessment is a key entry point where gender-responsive approach can be applied. And the reason being that the objective of applying gender-responsive approach at that specific step of the NAP process is to recognize and address gender differences in adaptation needs and priorities and capacities. So this is extremely important because different people have different vulnerabilities to climate change. And different people of different gender have different adaptation needs and priorities. And so vulnerability assessment as a key tool to address this. So concretely, what the government of Côte d'Ivoire did since the past 2 years, they developed a standardized approach to vulnerability assessment, taking gender equality into account. And the second step that they took is the mapping of sex disaggregated data and information at the national level to understand where this data is and what are the gaps. Aside from this, the government of Côte d'Ivoire also looked at how to apply gender-responsive approach along the enabling activities for its NAP process, and that's what it looks like. First, in terms of securing finance, they managed to secure finance from the Green Climate Funds to support the development of their NAP process, and they made sure to integrate gender consideration in this proposal. Secondly, the Ministry of Environment established a national platform on gender and climate change to bring actors working on climate change and actors working on gender together to enhance networking between those experts. And this is really important to ensure gender equitable stakeholder engagement in the NAP process. The third element is related to capacity development. So the Ministry of Environment also started to implement a capacity building plan for national actors on the linkages between gender and climate change. Again, this is essential because, as we know, engaging the gender actors in the NAP process are not sufficient if their capacities are not being built on the linkages between gender and climate change. And finally, a small group of gender and climate change experts worked together during a workshop to develop an advocacy note for their respective minister to raise their awareness on the importance and the need to better address the linkages between gender and climate change. So all these different activities led to the signature of the MOU that I mentioned earlier. And in addition to, or what I think supported all this advancement in terms of better integrated gender consideration in Côte d'Ivoire NAP process are two tools that have been used. The first one is a gender analysis that was conducted early in the process in 2018, which provided recommendation on how to integrate gender in the GCF NAP readiness proposal. And to date, the government is still implementing the recommendation from this analysis. And the second key tool that we use is the involvement of two national gender experts throughout the process over the long term. So what did we learn from applying the toolkit based on the experience from Côte d'Ivoire, but also other countries where we've been supporting gender responsive NAP processes? The first element is that really there are a lot of opportunities to adopt a gender responsive approach at any point of the NAP process. The second lesson is also that taking a gender responsive approach to the enabling activities for the NAP process is as important as trying to integrate gender consideration at any steps of the NAP process. The third lesson is related to gender analysis. What we are seeing is that they really work. Several countries where we have supported targeted gender analysis for the NAP process are now actively working to implement the recommendations. So what we see is that when countries are given concrete action on how to address this topic, they are ready to take steps. And finally, the last point I would like to mention is that most countries actually do have capacity in the area of gender, but what we see is often these capacities are not being leveraged or they are overlooked. So it is really crucial to involve gender experts as early as possible in the process. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Julie, for the presentation. I don't want you to go anywhere just yet, though. You're welcome to stop sharing your screen. And I wanted to ask a couple of follow-up questions, if that's okay. It was really exciting to hear the experience from Côte d'Ivoire and also, you know, this sort of what has been brought about after the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. And you did highlight this key point that, as we all know, is so critical, is gender analysis. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more on, you know, what does a NAP-focused gender analysis mean in terms of, you know, the approach that's used and when to use it.
Yes, thanks, Amy. So the approach that we've been using for these NAP-focused gender analysis really differ from one country to another, obviously, depending on where they are at in the NAP process and what they want to achieve from it. But generally speaking, we've conducted literature review. It's often based on a literature review in the country on the linkages between gender and climate change, and stakeholder engagement through interviews, workshops, and in some cases, surveys. And generally speaking also, these analyses tend to cover, I would say, 3 key themes. The first one is a policy and institutional analysis to understand how the linkages between gender and climate change is reflected in climate change policies and strategies, as well as gender and gender policies. And also, and very importantly, to undertake a sort of a mapping of who the actors are, who are the gender experts at the national level, who are the climate change experts, and who has knowledge on the linkages between the two. So that's the first element. The second element is more of a technical analysis, trying to document, based on available evidences, how people of different gender are impacted differently by climate change and what does it mean for adaptation. And then the third key element is an analysis of what does it mean for the NAP process in the country and the recommendation we can derive from this analysis. So these are the 3 key elements. And I think broadly speaking, the key advantage I could see based on the experience from Côte d'Ivoire, but also other countries, is one, these analysis has been extremely helpful in terms of framing the issue, how to talk about gender and the linkages between gender and climate change in your specific country context. We've seen, for example, when we did such analysis in Kiribati, that it was helpful to talk about climate resilient families and the role of women in ensuring climate resilient families. In Côte d'Ivoire, the feedback we receive is it's important to talk about equal opportunities instead of gender equality. So what we see is that often the term gender is abstract, not well understood, and there might be other ways to talk about this theme. So framing is one. Second is often we see that these gender analyses are a mean to bring climate change and adaptation experts together, sometimes for the first time at the national level. And the third is that these analyses often tend to provide a more nuanced and context-specific understanding of gender in the context of adaptation. So the feedback we often receive is that, again, the issue tend to be maybe too abstract, and linking gender with climate change is very helpful, the same way linking gender with poverty or linking gender with issues of education is helpful to make it a little bit more concrete. And I guess the last point in terms of when it makes sense to use this NAP-focused gender analysis, it can really be used at any point of the NAP process. So again, at the beginning of the NAP process, it can be helpful again to discuss and clarify the question around the framing, how best to talk about the link between gender and climate change in the country. Later on, it might be useful also to help prioritize adaptation option and make sure that gender equality is a key criteria. So this can be used at any points of the NAP process, really.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. And, and I guess pointing to some really critical issues that we still need to overcome in terms of these this understanding and these connections of the interlinkages between gender equality and climate change. And we've got a question from the audience, which I think it builds off a little bit of this, but also your presentation, that when you say that most countries have capacity in gender, can you give some examples? What do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, well, if I take the example of Kiribati, for example, a key issue in Kiribati is gender-based violence. And there is a lot of civil society organization working on this topic. Civil society organization, NGOs, etc., working on this topic. But so these are people understanding the issue of gender equality, but they have not been working on the linkages between climate change. So how can we engage these actors who understand the issue of gender equality in relation to another topic in this process? That's what we've done, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, where we brought, or the government brought 2 gender experts with no adaptation or climate change expertise, but they were able to, first of all, learn progressively about the topic and support the government to ensure that there was this gender lens provided throughout. So that's what I mean when I say that there are expertise often in the countries, but these gender experts are not necessarily yet working on climate change, but yet they have valuable expertise to bring to ensure that gender considerations are being taken into account. Absolutely,
absolutely. Let's slip in one more question, if that's all right, because I've got another one in the chat box for you. It says, the interesting presentation, but what created that political will in the government? And so this, I believe, is in the context to the example from Côte d'Ivoire. And, what drove, I suppose, that political will to be able to bring the Ministry of Women together along with the Ministry of Environment?
Well, that was a very long process. It didn't happen overnight. It really started in 2018 when the government undertook this gender analysis focused on the NAP process. And that gender analysis really provided some evidences on how gender impacts men and women differently in Côte d'Ivoire and what that means. And so then that sort of built the evidence, the business case, if you will. But then, as I mentioned, the different gender and climate change experts were brought together on a regular basis. And then there was this advocacy note that was developed. So throughout those steps, the minister were being briefed. So overall, it took 3 years. So the process was long, and there was all these different steps, meeting with the minister to inform them about what the team is doing on a regular basis. And really the advocacy note was about providing the evidences, showing the role of the Ministry of Women to address this issue and what are the impacts for their activities if they don't address this issue. Same for the Ministry of Environment. If they don't address these issues, all their investments are not going to be effective. This is key. So this whole process evidence bringing a team from the government, both of gender experts and adaptation experts together over a long term, training these people so that they are better equipped to talk about it. And the advocacy note that was presented to the cabinet of the minister. These are, I think, some of the key steps that started to, or at least allow this memorandum of understanding to get signed. And this is pretty exciting because we think that, government working in silos are not only probably the key barriers to effective climate adaptation, but it's probably also the main barrier to gender responsive climate actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's a process and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes time.
And just to give you a sense of the mobilization from the government of Côte d'Ivoire, presently they have 8 staff working to support the gender responsive NAP process. So it can seem a lot, but it's really what is needed on a long-term basis again, because having a consultant here and there is not enough. It's being able to work on a long term with gender experts, we're able to look at whatever the government is doing from a gender lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. I see more questions flooding in for you, Julie, but maybe let's...
Yeah, I can look at them and try to respond.
Let's put a pin so we can move on, but we may have a little time. You can answer some online, or we can always come back to them. So thank you so much, Julie. Let's turn our attention now over to nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which is a process that has been getting significant attention of late with the recent COP26 in Glasgow. And today we have Tara Daniel from the Women's Environment and Development Organisation joining us from the very early hours in the United States. Who's going to provide us with an overview of NDCs and also walk us through WEDO's framework and research on gender and NDCs. Tara, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here with you in your afternoons and evenings. And as we start looking at nationally determined contributions, I want to take us back to this first round when the first NDCs were submitted as intended nationally determined contributions. And during this process, WEDO wanted to find a way to evaluate the extent to which women's human rights were being recognized and what linkages there were between climate change and gender more broadly. And ultimately developed a methodology that recognized the context for implementation and for monitoring, that this really needed to go beyond a word search for gender within these NDCs. And part of that process as well was thinking about the advocacy power and the participation power that's possible when this information is available. So making each country profile and short analysis ultimately accessible on the Gender Climate Tracker app, which was intended and designed to be handheld by negotiators and advocates walking the halls of the climate negotiations, as well as the website, and each one being available in English, French, and Spanish. So what did this methodology look at? It started ultimately with looking at whether or not the NDC had specified the process through which it was developed. Was it a participatory process, particularly with mention of civil society stakeholders? Secondly, we looked at whether or not there was a specification of how ultimately this was going to be implemented. What were the policy frameworks, the legal frameworks, the committees that were being set up? What was the monitoring mechanism? And also including any mention of gender responsive budgeting when it was present in this understanding of how this NDC would be brought to fruition. Then there was that question, that fundamental question of, is there any reference to gender or women? And what's the context of that? Is it in reference to mitigation actions or adaptation actions? And furthermore, how are women being positioned? And I know that there was a question about intersectionality earlier, and I want to say that the way that this is framed is in no way reinforcing any sort of gender binary, but rather recognizing that when sexes or genders are identified within these documents, they're most commonly done so by calling out women and girls. And so the question was, are women being positioned as a group that's vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? Are they being positioned as beneficiaries, recognized as agents of change, or as stakeholders? Or is there a broader reference as well, where gender is really considered cross-cutting, where there's an explicit mention of gender mainstreaming, or you can see that one or more sectors is really being considered in the way that gender is being brought up within the NDC. We're calling that gender sensitivity. But then another key component of this was also recognizing what was the nature of the commitments to climate action being made within each of these roadmaps. Were these conditional or unconditional commitments, that conditional ones relying on the finance that has been pledged and should be provided by developed countries to developing countries? And lastly, are there other references to human rights, recognizing that women's human rights are at the heart of this? And as we look at how this methodology has been applied, and I think about the presentation that follows mine, I want to recognize that the Gender Climate Tracker is not the only place where this is being used. This has been adapted by CARE, who's also been doing a spotlight analysis around what they're seeing in this round of NDCs. But first, what did we see in the first NDCs? We saw that only 64 of them included a reference to women or gender, and these were entirely non-Annex I countries, which is really concerning on multiple levels, because the vast majority of NDCs from non-Annex countries have conditional actions within them. So it highlighted the vulnerability of these commitments to gender equality and to women's human rights, as well as the fact that women were most commonly, or gender was most commonly seen as an issue of adaptation, because the Annex I countries were so focused on mitigation within their NDCs. We also saw this narrative framing that is quite outdated. The idea that women are a vulnerable group, not just recognizing overlapping and intersecting oppressions and marginalization, but the fact that this was the most common way that that women and girls were being spoken of, rather than recognizing their role as agents of change, was concerning. And only about half of the first NDCs suggested that the process for developing the NDC was participatory. So if this is the baseline, what are we seeing now? So right now, this snapshot, we started looking last December when there were just 18 new and updated NDCs. We've been looking throughout this year. This snapshot right now is really just considering about 80 NDCs, considering the entire EU submission for those 27 parties as one submission, so representing 107 parties. And at a glance, we're seeing many more references to women and gender. We're seeing that Annex I countries have gotten the message. We're seeing a real jump overall in this category of gender sensitivity, but this category is doing a lot of work. But we're still seeing about 40% with that reference to women as a vulnerable group, but that's happening in concert with these other references as well, much more frequently. And only a handful of these NDCs were limiting their references to adaptation. These were broader references or included explicit references to mitigation as well. And so in comparing this specific lot of 80 NDCs to those 80 parties or those 107 parties earlier NDCs in the first round, we saw a huge jump in these particular parties taking up this reference to women or gender. And there was just a slight increase in participatory development, but I think that we do want to consider the context of there being a pandemic. And the fact is that we were seeing more details overall about how these NDCs developed and what were the processes that were bringing in different stakeholders, and whether they were in person or virtual also being mentioned. But to this idea of gender sensitivity, we were seeing this broader inclusion of gender, this commitment overall to the idea of gender equality that was usually tagged and recognized as making the NDC gender sensitive, but how robustly that was actually being done, how well integrated gender was into specific actions varied widely. There might have been one mention of the importance of gender equality and a recognition of the impacts of climate change, the variable impacts of climate change across all genders. Other NDCs, and we're developing some better models, and you'll be hearing about one of them in just a few minutes. We're really walking through all of their actions and plans and saying the specific ways in which, for example, a gender analysis may be done or required or was informing the set of actions that were being set forth. So as we consider some of the emerging insights from this snapshot in time, we want to talk about the importance of setting expectations and having this normative framework. I think there was a lot of attention last time to the scarcity of mentions and the limited nature of those mentions. But coming out of COP24, there was a decision that specifically outlined that this was information that could be included, and it includes in a gender responsive manner. We saw several NDCs that were using this outlined information as an annex, and this sometimes was the only place when they were being prompted to outline and share that information about what is the relationship of gender within this NDC. As I mentioned before, we are seeing more attention to outlining the process and just seeing those details of how each NDC came to be, especially I think considering the longer planning time compared to the intended nationally determined contributions. We're also noting that there's more details about implementation and monitoring from about half of these NDCs, again, just using that subset of 80 to 90% of these particular ones. But the focus is more on implementation. And without that focus on monitoring, we're really left with questions about accountability, which again speaks to how important it is to have the NDCs themselves, as well as analyses available and accessible to advocates who can ask questions and can follow up on these commitments, even when these commitments to gender equality are being made in sometimes vague terms, general terms, non-specific terms. But overall, I think we're heartened by this greater likelihood of seeing support for these principles. We want to also make sure that we're highlighting the connections between these NDCs and how they're considering gender overall within this idea of climate ambition, because without NDCs that ultimately work collectively to keep the global temperature at 1.5 degrees or lower, we're not going to be able to achieve gender equality, and we're not going to see that interplay of gender justice and climate justice that's really critical to the survival of our world. And I think it's important to note that even the NDC synthesis report, last updated right before COP at the end of October, was calling out and was noting specifically how well parties were or were not starting to integrate gender, because creating that expectation is really important. But this is also a report that was highlighting that by 2030, we're still looking at an anticipated 16% increase in emissions from 2010, rather than any decrease. I want to also point out that IUCN has also been tracking and looking at the NDCs using a different methodology, but overall, there's so much alignment between what we're seeing and finding. And they have highlighted in a recent analysis, including NDCs through September as well, that the 20 parties that did not include gender mentions are those with the greatest responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's a framework to keep in mind, and that is also going to come up in the presentation that follows mine. But with that, I'm really excited to engage with your questions.
Thank you so much, Tara. You covered a lot of ground for us. And I am going to hang on for a second, if you don't mind. I've got a question in. I mean, you've pointed to this already about how we're going to finance gender responsive climate action. And we can talk about NDCs, but what, I think what people really want to hear about now is how they're going to get implemented. And so we've got a question in the chat box that says, it's absolutely crucial for gender responsive NDC implementation to have a financing plan. So gender responsive budgeting, dedicated finance for gender outcomes. So from your analysis, can you share any good practices, tools, or approaches that you saw?
Yeah, the thing that pops to mind the most right now is that this is something that's come up a lot with National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points recently. And the UNFCCC Gender Team had a webinar where they were discussing gender responsive budgeting and providing tools and analysis. And I think this is important because one of the things that we considered in some of our earlier analyses when we were looking at NDC processes overall, and in tying back to this conversation that we were having with Julie about gender capacity and gender expertise, is understanding where capacity lies within institutions and what capacity is needed, and how particular people as well as particular institutions can ultimately be involved in NDC processes. So thinking about this capacity building for National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points on gender responsive budgeting, how can that ultimately be brought into NDC processes the same way that we would expect this leveraging of ministries of women's affairs, gender, within these processes too, and taking advantage of existing capacity across the suite of ministries and institutions and departments that may exist, but might not be brought into a process that's often siloed. And I think that speaks overall to the importance of detailing also the participation aspect of these processes, because when we understand who is invited to participate, we can start looking at a full suite of stakeholders for that. And I also did really appreciate highlighting the capacity and the availability through the NAP processes for access to finance, particularly through the Green Climate Fund support for NAP processes, because I think there are ways as well in which the processes for NAPs should, again, be in conversation with and contributing to the conversations around the development and the processes for NDCs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might keep you on finance for one more second, and sort of the concepts of gender responsive budgeting, and we're looking at climate finance and domestic funds, but perhaps maybe then you have some light to shed on the broader context, of global climate finance and where we are with that, and how we link that to the presentation that you just made.
Absolutely. And this is why I think it is really critical that one of the things that we do is look at whether or not these commitments are conditional or unconditional. Because if we are only having this intention to advance gender equality be expressed conditionally, and we're failing collectively to meet the pledged amount, which we know is not in any way, shape, or form enough to meet the true needs and the scope of needs for climate action, then we're not truly making a commitment to gender equality. So thinking too about the ways in which climate finance should be expressed by developed countries, and those commitments should be ultimately, how those commitments should ultimately be expressed in their NDCs as well. Because if they are expressing a commitment to gender equality, they need to be expressing the ways in which they're fulfilling their fair share of climate finance. I think that this question of as well the specificity of actions is really crucial as we move from these general statements of support for gender equality, understanding how gender analyses will inform specific actions, means mapping out real financial plans for how that will be operationalized. And so there are so many ways in which the current moment in this failure to truly outline a way to provide the finance that is needed, recognizing the trillions of dollars that were recently highlighted by the Standing Committee on Finance's new report on the determination of needs of developing countries, is ultimately showing that we have to walk the talk when it comes to gender equality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take this. We have another question, which is a big question. Maybe let's take the first part and then we can come back and you can also try and answer some in the chat. But I think it's a really interesting point here, is that how, what role does the private sector have to play in a lot of this? And how can we maybe increase that pressure as well to ensure that we're getting gender responsive climate action and investments?
Yeah, so I really appreciate this question because I think it comes up a lot when we're having these climate finance discussions. And so looking at it twofold. So what is the role of the private sector, and making sure that once again, public institutions are defining their needs and recognizing where there might be strategic opportunities to involve the private sector, but also recognizing that many of those needs when it comes to climate finance and when it comes to gender equality, that we are talking about a debt that is owed in terms of grant-based finance flowing from developed countries to developing countries in order to ensure that the historical burden of greenhouse gas emissions is not borne solely by those on the front lines of climate impacts. And this question also speaks to the role of ESG reporting. And it is really critical. And I think some of the things that we were talking about with Julie just a few minutes ago, the importance of having in-house gender capacity within private sector institutions is absolutely critical. Recognizing that there is a huge return on investment. And going back to the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which really did recognize that we're not going to have effective and sustainable climate action without gender equality. So this is not a question of how the private sector can get involved in gender. This is a question of how are we addressing this global challenge in a way that is centered in human rights and is ultimately going to meet the needs of the humans that would like to survive and thrive on a planet that is only warmed 1.5 degrees or less.
Very nicely said. That's a perfect way to stop you there. And if we have more questions, we'll see if we can squeeze some more in a little bit later. So thank you so much, Tara. So I am very privileged today to be here not only as a representative for ADB facilitating the session, but also wearing a different hat in another role on behalf of UN Women. And so I'm really glad to be able to share the results of a recent study that was done. And as we, as we were talking and Tara shared her experiences, the methodology, and also, the processes and challenges of WEDO's work, I think it leads nicely into what I can present here today. So this particular piece of collaborative research looks at Asia Pacific's progress towards gender responsive NDCs, and most certainly a lot of our inspiration has come from WEDO and their methodology and their tracking, which has really been exceptional in the last few years. And so this particular project was a collaboration with UNESCAP, UNEP, and UN Women. And we conducted an assessment of climate ambition and the enabling factors to support the implementation of the NDCs in 49 Asia Pacific countries. And so as part of this collaboration, UN Women were invited to join and try and understand how gender and climate change links are being recognised in NDCs in the Asia Pacific. So I'm going to be nice and brief today and tell you what we did. So we gathered lots and lots of evidence from 49 different countries. So we analysed NDCs. We also looked at NAPs. We looked at national communications, which is submitted to the UNFCCC. And then we looked at national level climate change laws, policies, strategies, and plans. And then we also looked on the flip side. We looked at gender equality frameworks. So we looked at CEDAW periodic reporting. We looked at Beijing national review reportings. We looked at national gender equality laws, policies, strategies, and plans. And all of this data was analysed and coded and scored. And we ended up with a 5-point scale. And these were what represented the enabling factors. So the enabling factors that were used as the axis of analysis were developed as part of a preliminary study that was done by ESCAP and UNEP, and they were adapted for the purpose of this gender analysis to really assess the gender dimension. So the 4 enabling factors that we looked at were gender and climate change mainstreaming, gender in climate change coordination processes or institutional frameworks. We looked at gender and climate finance, very hot topic. And we looked at gender in reporting or MRV processes, which is, as we know, so crucial to understanding how change is actually happening and making sure that commitments that are made are being translated into actual action. So I'm going to just give a very brief snapshot of what we found, and I can also provide you with the link for the full report. Is 1.5 degrees within reach for the Asia Pacific in the chat box later, so you can look through it a little bit further. So what did we find? Under our first metric, we found that 10 out of 49 countries actually scored the highest possible score in gender mainstreaming and climate change. Under the second metric, which was on gender inclusive processes, we found that 23% of countries have what we classified as gender inclusive processes, where climate change coordination mechanisms include the role of the women's machinery or women's ministry. And really importantly, that climate change has also been integrated in national gender equality frameworks. So we've got this sort of two tracks, and they're mainstreamed in both. Under gender and climate finance, we found only 2 in 49 countries link gender and climate finance within climate policies, such as maybe the climate financial fiscal frameworks, or specific reference to gender responsive budgeting. And finally, we found that, unfortunately, at the moment, on the last indicator on reporting, only 63%, we found that 63% of countries in the Asia Pacific do not recognise yet the need for sex, age, diversity disaggregated data or indicators in their monitoring and reporting. So I think really building off, what Tara and others who are also really trying to understand how gender is progressing in the NDCs, we still have a long way to go. We have seen some really important action in this region, in the Asia Pacific region, which is something that we really need to grab that momentum and keep running with it. And so this analysis, it provides a bit of a baseline, I guess you could say, in terms of the integration of gender in the Asia Pacific NDCs, and an assessment framework for understanding how gender and inclusion are included in climate policy, in general, and how climate change is being recognised and action taken in gender equality frameworks and commitments. And this approach can be really used as a measurement tool. So as part of the NDC cycle update, it can be used, to measure how that level of integration has changed. And importantly, this gender analysis that was part of this much bigger report, it's really pleasing and exciting to say that the results of the gender analysis were quantitatively given equal weighting to other scores, whether that be greenhouse gas emission reduction or decarbonisation commitments, etc. So I think there's really, it's really quite important in that regard. And this particular initiative as well is part of the Empower project, UN Women and UN Environment Program's regional project on gender and climate change. And it's really working to build that evidence base. That evidence base that's needed really here in the Asia Pacific to support, advocacy on gender responsive climate actions and really take the findings of this and target and catalyse action on improving the integration of gender and really the action and the implementation, which we hope to see will come in the next few years with NDC implementation in the region. So let me just stop there, and perhaps what we might do is we've got one more speaker today, so we perhaps will move on to the final presentation, and then we can take any other additional questions perhaps towards the end. So I am very happy to introduce our final presenter today, who unfortunately, due to bandwidth and internet issues, isn't able to be with us right now, but has sent a presentation in. Her name is Radha, Wagle, the National Gender and Climate Change Focal Point from the government of Nepal. And she's going to share a case study with us from Nepal. Please enjoy, and then following that, we can take some final questions and get some final comments from all of our presenters today. Thanks so much. Enjoy her presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Today, I am going to present about Nepal's second NDC process from GESI perspective. This presentation gives a slight glimpse of Nepal's NDC development process, how we were being able to incorporate gender and social inclusion in our NDC, second NDC. First of all, I would like to give a small glimpse of our second nationally determined contribution, which was submitted in UNFCCC back in 8th December 2020. It has both quantified and policy targets for mitigation as well as adaptation. we have provided some of the adaptation priorities as well. And the time frame is 2021 to 2025 and 2021 to 2030. And the sectoral consideration includes FOLU, energy, IPPU, WAS, which is also described by IPCC guideline. And by 2030, we have planned to reduce 28% of GHG emission from the transport sector and 23% of GHG from cooking sector. And it contains both unconditional and conditional targets. The cost of achieving Nepal's NDC conditional mitigation targets is estimated to be US $25 billion, and the unconditional target is US $3.4 billion, which is expected to be fulfilled by internal resources, and rest of 25 million will be fulfilled by international climate funding. And Nepal's NDC process was quite exhaustive process. The NDC was developed through consultative process, and we adopted inclusive and participatory approach, and with a series of consultation at national and provincial levels. And there were more than 30 consultation meetings were conducted, and that was virtual and in person as well. And Nepal's NDC formulation was a country-driven process as well, and we have followed the principle of leave no one behind. And local peoples, women's, indigenous people, people with disabilities, and youth all are participated in during the process. However, it was a bit challenging to incorporate all the categories of people because of the situation of COVID and other in-country problems. And a team of experts reviewed overarching and sectoral policies, strategies, and programs, and coordinated the process of gathering data and performing analysis. And after making a small draft that was available in the website for the comments, and after getting some comments from different stakeholders, that was thoroughly incorporated all the valid comments and suggestions before finalizing. And our NDC targets consist of forestry targets, transportation, e-cooking, waste, which is very important in terms of gender and social inclusion. And Nepal is also renowned for the community-based forest management, and we have 45% total country's area under forest cover by 2030. That is our target, and which is a highly participatory program which has different community-based modalities, and gender and social inclusion is highly accounted in forest management in Nepal. Similarly, there is transport sector, energy sector, and other important sector, energy sector. And by 2030, 25% of household level cooking stove will be electric stoves. That is also important in terms of gender perspective, or more from women's perspective, because in Nepal, women are more responsible for household level cooking, and that has some co-benefits too, because when women, they use fuel, firewood in houses, there is a problem of respiratory disease, and even the kids, they have some respiratory problem. And after establishment of electric stoves, that will be reduced significantly. And similarly, we have other cooking stoves target and household biogas plant target. That is all related to gender and social inclusion perspective. And we have targeted that we will reach net zero emission by 2050, but now our long-term strategy also more ambitious than the current NDC, and we have planned to achieve net zero by 2045. And similarly, we have other policy targets too, that is related to soil organic matter, cattle sheds, and organic fertilizer production, climate smart villages. All those have a huge concern of gender perspective. And in policy-related targets, we have incorporated 3 major policy targets in terms of gender and social inclusion. That is, by 2030, we will develop an action plan for integrating gender and social inclusion in achieving NDC targets. And similarly, we are having plan to promote the leadership, participation, and negotiation capacity of women, indigenous people, and youth in climate change forums. And similarly, ensure gender disaggregated data when reporting on progress and achievements. These are the 3 major key pillars under the gender and social inclusion. And similarly, we have one policy in the country, that is gender and climate change policy, that has identified different gender perspective in different sectors. And we have also a concrete action plan to incorporate gender perspective in different thematic areas. However, we have some challenges we faced during the NDC formulation process. Due to COVID, there was low chances of gender-wise representation in virtual setting because of access to women's access to internet and other electronic media. However, we tried our best to make more participatory. And there was a common narrative, or still there is a common narrative, that it is a technical matter and why women should participate in this NDC formulation process. That was a bit difficult to convince the wider stakeholders, even the personnel from the government side. And while finalized, there was a huge debate regarding action plan preparation. I already mentioned that there were 3 major points, key pillars in GESI, and that was highly debated to incorporate in our NDC. But finally, we tried to incorporate those points, and we were become successful to put that point, and which ultimately made our NDC world renowned. How I can explain here. And the CARE International, I think, has evaluated some of the recent nationally determined contribution. And out of those NDCs, Nepal's and Marshall Islands NDC become more gender responsive. That is, they mentioned that is role model group of NDC, and it has achieved out of total six targets. And now Nepal's NDC is known as one of the most GESI responsive NDC. And similarly, there was also one evaluation by Climate Tracker in terms of 1.5 degree Paris Agreement compatibility, and our NDC become one of the almost sufficient category. I would like to share this happiness of being one of the successful NDC in terms of GESI perspective and in terms of ambition as well. And today, I am not able to address your questions since I am recording this presentation, and I am happy to respond to your question. If you have further queries, you can email me. And thank you for providing this opportunity to FAO and colleague from UNFCCC Gender Team. Thank you so very much.
Even though she's not here, I want to thank very much Radha for her time today, and recording and sharing that presentation with us. And I think there's some really excellent examples, and Nepal most certainly is one of them. And I think that some of these commitments that Radha shared in her presentation really echo what we're hearing. I can certainly, from the perspective of the UN Women, UN Environment and UN SCAP report, confirm our findings are very similar. Nepal is really an exemplary example in many ways of a gender responsive NDC, and really, really integrates sort of the concept of intersectionality, looks at inclusion, and and not just perhaps in very much lip service ways. There's really this strong commitment, and it's very reflective of the effort that's been made there. So we thank her very much for her time. Now we have a couple minutes left. I'd like to ask Julie and Tara to turn on their cameras and join me here. And what we might do is just take a few final comments, either answering some of the remaining questions that we have, or making a few final comments before we finish up for today. So Julie, I might start with you.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so I think I have one outstanding question, which is how to encourage intersectionality and participants from marginalized groups in NAPs, which is a great question. I think generally this topic is still not very well addressed so far based on the evidence that we have. And I think this is a really important topic, in part because gender is not always the most important factors when it comes to understand climate change impact and vulnerabilities. So I think one entry point again to looking into this is to bring expert civil society organizations specifically working on gender as it intersects with other factors of inequalities in the mechanism for stakeholder engagement in the NAP process. Covering the issue in NAP-focused gender analysis would also, I think, be helpful. Recently, we conducted such an analysis, not such an analysis, but we conducted a gender analysis in Chad, and the gender analysis was supposed to inform the NAP process, but we took a slightly different approach, focusing on trying to understand knowledge, behavior, and attitudes as it relates to the link between gender and climate change. And I'm raising this because what came from the survey is that a fair number of stakeholders at the national level indicated that they thought that there was other forms of inequalities that were more important to address than gender inequalities. So our work did not manage to sort of delve into that, but we thought that that was very interesting. And then again, just to go back to using vulnerabilities assessment as a key entry point to go deeper in understanding risks and vulnerabilities, and again, aspects of intersectionality, I think is a key entry point to start delving into the topic. And of course, recognizing that the NAP process is iterative, so that there is an opportunity really for government and other stakeholders to learn and improve as we move forward.
Excellent, thank you so much. Tara, did you want to take a stab at some of those remaining questions or any final thoughts that you have?
Yes, I couldn't agree more with Julie about the imperative of ensuring that we have an intersectional group of folks at every table. So we need women and gender groups, we need indigenous peoples, we need youth, we need these processes to be truly participatory and inclusive. And that goes for NAPs, that goes for NDCs, and that doesn't mean a one-time consultation meeting. That means long-term engagement. And this is important for actually pushing this envelope on climate ambition that we know is crucial here. It's important for ensuring that this amazing expertise that is held by those folks that have been doing the work on the ground and promoting and implementing integrated, holistic solutions and creating transformation at a small community-based scale are given the opportunity to apply that expertise to a larger scale, as well as noting when we go back to this question of climate finance, one of the big challenges that was recognized coming out of this UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance report on trying to grapple with the needs of developing countries was that there was not enough information and data on local needs. So how can these processes, by ensuring that there is true voice and representation, better highlight these needs so that that could never be used as an excuse for the lack of finance flowing where it needs to go, I think is a really important question. I see also that Darlene has put in the chat this question about the biggest challenge that we face in terms of climate change action. And I would say it is understanding the interlinkages of recovering from a pandemic while fighting climate change, while addressing a biodiversity crisis, while advancing gender equality. Because if we are living in a world where we're trying to prioritize one over the other, rather than recognizing that these are emerging from the same set of root causes and the same set of siloed thinking and failed solutions, then we are once again dooming ourselves to failure. So I think I can leave it at that for the moment. Thank you so much.
I think it was very eloquently put. And I think that's such a, I mean, it's a great question, but it was also a great answer, I think, Tara, because it's something that we looked at a little bit as well in this report with UNEP and ESCAP, that particularly in the context of Asia Pacific, nations perhaps don't have different sets of funds for COVID recovery as they do for climate change action and sustainable development. So how are we linking these, these recovery packages? How are we pushing this green recovery and really trying to sort of capitalize on this moment of perhaps not maybe where we all wish we were, but where we find ourselves, and really try and take it with both hands and run with it with that really human rights based and central, inclusion in approach. I think we're getting close to the end of our, I just wanted to ask Julie if she had one more, any other thoughts on what Tara had said, or any other final comments there before we say goodbye.
No, I think this idea of the importance of more coordinated action is at the center. And as I said earlier, I think this is the main barrier to advancing climate adaptation and gender responsive climate action. So and I think both the NDCs and the NAP process are trying to advance a more coordinated action. So I cannot agree more.
Perfect, and thank you very much to our friends in the chat for participating and sharing comments and questions. I wanted to thank all of our speakers here who are with us today, and also who aren't, for their time and for coming along. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a very good evening, and we really hope you enjoy the rest of the ADB Gender Forum and the final day tomorrow. Good night.